תודה רבה, זה כבוד גדול להיות בפאנל ביחד עם ידידי הרב יצחק וידידי הרב מאיר שלמדנו ביחד בישיבה. זה גם כן כבוד גדול להיות עם משפחת ליכטנשטיין ודוקטור טובה וגם כל המשפחה המורחבת שגם כן הכניסוני לתוך הבית ויש לי המון זיכרונות טובות, אז תודה רבה. וגם כן תודה לכל המארגנים שהזמינו אותי. אני אעבור לאנגלית, להרצאה. גם כן, אני רוצה, וזה לפני הזמן, אני הזכרת את השבת הזה, הייתי שם באותו שבת גם כן, אבל אני זוכר את זה קצת אחרת. אחרי השיעור של שעה שהסביר את כל השיטות, וריבי רב וכו' וכו', אז הוא אמר את זה נכון, שאנחנו פה בישיבה ואנחנו לכתחילה, אבל אם היית פוסק ככה לבעל הבתים זה לא היה נכון. וכרב קהילה, לא הייתי רב קהילה באותו זמן, אבל לקחתי את זה. ההבנה שיש מצבים שונים והלכה ושעת הדחק וכל מיני, אז קצת, ההדגש היה קצת שונה. Okay, thank you very much again for the invitation. I wrote in 2014, Tradition put out a very special volume in honor of Rav Lichtenstein's 80th birthday, but like many journals, didn't come out till after his 80th birthday. I wrote a piece there about, it was called Divrei Harav, V'divrei HaTalmid, V'divrei Harav, the impact of the thought of Rav Joseph B. Soloveitchik on Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein. And I tried to summarize there the impact of the Rav in a number of key tchumim, starting of course with Talmud Torah, because that was the most important thing in both of their lives and the ikar isuk of their lives and the time that they spent in terms of derech halimud and the comparison and the differences which many people have written about, and other areas, engagement with the world, secular studies, religious Zionism, attitude to secular Jews, etc. And I tried to highlight the tremendous impact of the Rav and the similarities, as well as some of the differences in that area. For the paper that I wrote for this conference, which I wrote in Hebrew, but I tried to expand on some of those topics since then, as well as focus on one or two other topics, which I'd like to focus on in my short time. I would just mention in terms of, it's obviously that great people who are influenced by others are obviously sometimes, because they're independent and not just robots, and as I title this article, Talmid Velo Chassid, Rav Aaron was a Talmid Muvhak of the Rav, but he wasn't a Chassid. Yesterday it was mentioned, I mean, obviously everybody can disagree with a mentor in some things. I just wanted to show, and on small things, meaning on the big things, you know, they obviously were in sync, but in small things, just mentioned yesterday, one or two things that was mentioned about sexuality. So the tzitut was in Hebrew, but again, in English, in the original, it's after he tries to find sources and he quotes that the Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik, tried to put that into the Rambam, the positive attitude. So he writes, Rav Aaron writes, it must be conceded that the attempt is far from convincing, with the reference to the excerpt cited highly selective, bordering on the tendentious. I mean, to write something like that about your Rebbe is on the tendentious. I mean, I would be afraid, but Rav Aaron wrote it. And of course, in other small areas, Rav Aaron was willing to disagree. Just take a small thing. In terms of Nachem on Tisha B'Av, the Rav was very insistent that you have to keep the Nusach. I just want to mention a cute anecdote. My friend Rav Meir once mentioned to me, I was talking to him about this, and Rav Meir said, my grandfather was against change in Nusach HaTfilah, except the changes that he liked to make. And that's true. You know, anybody who grew up in Boston knows the Rav had certain shtiklach and certain changes that he made, and he certainly believed in that. But of course, Rav Aaron changed a couple of words to reflect the reality of the return to Zion and Yerushalayim, and the Rav was very, very vigorously opposed. And just one final note, a small thing, again, but these are small things. I want to talk about just one major thing. Everyone, of course, knows the famous presentation of the Rav about in Kol Dodi Dofek about the question about suffering, that we don't ask questions of why, but we focus on the what, and what is the human being going to do given the reality of suffering, and how do we deal with it. And Rav Aaron, in his article about suffering, the duties of the heart and response, writes the following. After he summarizes the Rav's perspective, he writes, while the man of destiny described by the Rav in Kol Dodi Dofek falls into the category, as a summary of the approach of Yahadut in general, however, this strikes me as overly sweeping. And again, interesting, he wasn't just simply willing to accept what his Rebbe said, but he had histayguyot, as they say in good English. Okay. I want to focus on one area, which to me is just interesting to me as a mechanech, and that is the derech ha-pedagogit, the approach of teaching between the Rav and Rav Aaron. So, of course, you know, we, many of us, especially people who are younger, Rav Lau, Baruch Hashem, thank God he's with us, and Dr. Tova is here, you know, they knew the Rav in the 50s, and some people even knew the Rav in the 40s, and in the 30s. But they, right, and there are people that knew the Rav. Many of us, I see Barry Eisenberg and people who were in the Rav Shir in the 60s and late 60s and 70s. Their experience of the Rav, as Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, my teacher in graduate school, once said, they saw the Rav as a grandfather rather than as a father. He was a gentle old man telling nice stories, etc. Professor Chaim at the Hesped at NYU spoke about the change after 1967, where the Rav went from being a father, disciplined, tough, to being a grandfather figure, much more sweet. And obviously, but people who know the Rav from the 40s and 50s in his class, he was very tough. And sometimes I remember when I was a kid in YU, the stories they would tell, they would make your hair stand on edge. And today some of those things we would call almost abuse. I mean, they were so sharp. You know, the Rav would call somebody, if he didn't like a svara, somebody said, he would call him a ferd. A ferd in Yiddish means a horse. I mean, you know, they were very tough. What?
Poyer was like
right. So Rav Aaron writes about the fact that in Beit Brisk, it was a very demanding, and the result was like swinging for the fences, which is a baseball reference. More home runs and more strikeouts. In almost every generation, there were people who paid a price in simple mental health, but at the same time, their environment produced Torah giants. Rav Aaron added that with the Rav, Beit Brisk, Rav Moshe, and Rav Chaim produced a grand slam. I don't know in Hebrew you would say Hatzlacha Adira, but more than that, a grand slam. Right. Okay, so, but on the other hand, Rav Aaron talks about the fact in his autobiography, when he talks about how to raise children, he writes about the fact that the Rav grew up not in yeshiva, but with his father, and he learned with his father of Moshe for 10 to 12 hours a day. And when I say learned, quote, I mean learned. If the Rav hesitated or if Moshe thought he was goofing off a little bit, he let him have it. What does he let him have it mean? So in an essay about the Rabbi Aviad HaKohen put, Sachli Pam Achi Harav, Rab Shmuel Yaakov, Shekihen ke Professor Lechimia, Yodea ta lama Achi Harid Yatsa kefi sheyatsa, ההפרש בינינו מצד הגיל איננו גדול. אבא רב משה היה לומד עם שנינו כאחד. הוא היה נוהג להסביר נקודה, ומיד לאחר מכן שאל את רב יוסף דוב, פרשטייט, אתה מבין? ואחי שלא תמיד הבין היה עונה לא. אינני מבין. אינך מבין היה אבא צועק? היי לך, היה אומר אבא, ומכבד אותו בשתי סטירות לחי. זה מה שרב אהרן אמר על אביו. שרב שמואל אמר על שקיבל רב סולובייצ'יק עצמו. אני לעומת זאת תוסיף רב שמואל לאחר שראיתי מה שקרה, החלטתי שאני מבין כבר בפעם הראשונה, תקף ומיד. וכך סיים רב שמואל יעקב, מתוך אי ההבנה של הרב ומתוך ההבנה שלי, הוא צמח והיה לגדול בישראל, ואני יצאתי כפי שיצאתי. That's a very sharp description which Rav Lichtenstein presented about דרכו החינוכית של the Rav. And of course, and Rav Aaron wrote in a very revealing thing, he talked about karov, that those who were even closer in the mishpacha, those who grew up with the Rav Aaron learned with the Rav when he was in Boston, and they experienced that terror and that derech, but he was trying to push them. The she'ifot hagdolot, haytam, again quoting Rav Aaron, haytan imam murgeshet heitev shel hatalat mora, metach velachatz shayu murgashim ba'avir. הכרתי לו תלמיד אחד ולא שניים שלא היו מסוגלים לאכול לפני השיעור מפני שחשו לבריאותם הפיזית והנפשית. Rav Aaron, of course, was very different. Anyone who ever learned with Rav Aaron, he was so nice, he was so gentle. Even if you said a bad svara in shir, okay. The most, I remember once, Rav Aaron presented a problem about two sugyot, and some Talmid, an Israeli, said, Vaday yesh chiluk. So Rav Aaron goes, so the guy said, yesh chiluk. So Rav Aaron said, Vaday yesh chiluk, ma chiluk. He wanted the guy to push himself a little bit, but it was never anything like in terms of that. And so what is the source? Why was it so different? So I just have some hasharot, which I want to bring, and people, obviously, two different kinds of personalities, two different educational systems, two different worlds in which they grew up. But obviously, even though, as was mentioned, Rav Lichtenstein's parents grew up, and his mother was from the aristocracy of Lithuanian and Telz. However, their house was not a house, as far as I understand, where that was that metach. The Rav talks about how Rav Moshe never gave him a kiss in one essay, and things like that. Wasn't the world in which he grew up. He grew up in a world, in a family that was extremely, extremely loving. They pushed their children, but certainly in terms of the outward expressions. Obviously, the family, Rav Moshe loved the Rav very much, but the outward expressions. Rav Aaron, of course, experienced himself. He was in yeshiva settings, which the Rav never went to. He learned with his father and only with his father. Rav Aaron also understood, and I think lived in a very different time than the world in which Rav Hutner and the Rav grew up. Rav Aaron writes about אותו סכנה של נטישה טוטלית קיימת תמיד, במיוחד בחברה שבו אנו חיים, פועלים, לומדים ולמדים. סכנה של מבעט ברבו ויוצא, סכנה של ילד ילך וידבק בעשיו אחיו, והדברים ידועים. And he spoke about that they grew up in a different era. הרב ז"ל גדל בבית ובסביבה שבהם הקשר לתורה היה כה חזק, שגם מים רבים לא היו יכולים לכבות אהבה זו לתורה, ואפילו לא צעקה וגערה, גם אם היא אבן מקיר זעק וכפייס מעץ יענה. אכן תלמיד ממוצע כיום שבא מישיבה תיכונית ואפילו מעבר לזה איננו ספוג כל כך באהבת תורה ואריסתו, איננו חסין מפני הפגיעה באהבת תורה שבו, בשעה שהקפדן הוא זה שמלמד אותו. אני יכול להעיד מניסיונו האישי, בקיץ ראשון שהייתי כאן בארץ בשנת תשכ"ב, גרתי אצל קרובי משפחה בשכונת גאולה. נוהג הייתי לעבור בשעות בוקר ליד שוק מחנה יהודה, ליד אחד מבתי כנסת הספרדיים שמתוכם עלה ובקע כל תינוקות של בית רבן הצורכים במלוא גרונם פרקי תהילים. היו שם שאגות ועלבונות והילדים המסכנים סגפו הכל. אמרתי לעצמי, שמא הם גדלו בתרבות ששם דבר זה מקובל. אך לו היו נוהגים כך כלפיי, לו הייתי מקבל מתח כזה של עלבונות וביזיונות, הייתי אומר כבר מזמן שלום לנעים זמירות ישראל. Very straightforward. And therefore, Rav Aaron was very, very fond of quoting. If I'm not mistaken, it was from Rav Meir Schlesinger. Is he still alive?
Yeah, sure.
So Rav Meir, I don't know. So Rav Meir Schlesinger, who was the Rosh Hashiva of Shalavim, that he was very fond of quoting, that Rav Meir used to say that in the time of Chazal, small doche uyamin mikarevet, about vizman hazeh small mikarevet v'yavin mikarevet. Tzrichim shnehem lekarev today. And Rav Aaron continued in that approach. At one time, if you were very hard on students and they didn't like you, they left your school and went to another framework. Today, if a child drops out of school, he drops out of Shabbat, he drops out of God. Teachers, and even more so parents, must find the proper combination of communicating values and making demands, but radiating love. This is the mix that defines raising children. And Rav Aaron would often speak in public about his chalishas adas. I remember he said that in a speech in Lincoln Square. I have chalishas adas about chalishut adat, about the Haredi world. Some people, they're safalei keturah, that they push their kids full, they stuff them like an ox full of Torah. And he said, I didn't make that decision. And Rav Moshe, in one of the Haspedim, he talks about speaking to his father about that before he got married, about raising children. And I think finally, Rav Aaron also, as many people have noted, the word lehishtadel was very central to his mishtadel. And Henry Moore was mentioned yesterday and today, so I'll also mention Henry Moore. There's a passage in Henry Moore's in the dissertation where Rav Aaron writes, Judaism has gone a step further, insisting that God must be served with the head as well as with hands and heart. It has seen intellection as an integral part of the religious experience. It has recognized that a man's quest for God, significant success in the exercise of reason cannot come to all or to many, but has demanded that none forego the attempt. It is precisely for the effort, the process of the effort, that traditional Judaism has pressed most insistently. Of Yediat Torah, the knowledge of Torah, the rabbis had relatively little to say, but of Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, they can never say enough. And I think that's also a key. For Rav Aaron, the Echad HaMarbev, Echad HaMamit, the Hishtadlut, was more important than the Totzaot. I mean, obviously, as he often would say, Echad HaMarbev, Echad HaMamit, it's always better to be a Marbe than to be the Mamit. But it was the Hishtadlut, the commitment, that ultimately defined it. And this is ultimately why I think, in addition to all the personal reasons, and again, we don't want to be armchair psychologists and all that, I think also why Rav Aaron. So again, I spoke just on one topic. There's many other topics I wrote about in the paper and in my other paper, but hopefully it'll come into print, and we will all encourage Professor Gidi to put it out as soon as